Everything seemed to have changed. The century was only 10 years old, and now she was walking her way back from work. She hadn't always worked in the factory making nails. In fact, when she was younger, she had worked on the farms that she was walking past now. She could remember, before the century had changed, what it had been like when she'd been a girl. The fields were all green, but now, in the heart of them all, there were mines and pits, and that is where her husband had worked. It was a good job. There was lots of work to do, and with the job working in the pit, they got a cottage, and the cottage was filled with themselves and their 7 children. But they always made do. They could make and mend anything. And her husband would go off and he'd work down the pit. It was dark and dangerous work, and the house was good and the money was coming in, but then there was the disaster. The coal damp had set fire down in the pits, and the ceilings had fallen in, and his body was never found. But I'll tell you, the house that they got was tied to the job that he had, and when he was dead, whether she was a widow or not, then she was turned out of the miner's cottage. And that was why she'd had to find work for herself and her 2 oldest boys. The rest of them could do a little bit of work here and there and get maybe 2pence a week. But she was working hard in the nail factory on the outskirts of Bedlington, and now she was walking back towards the house that they'd found. It seemed like the money wasn't going very far, but she would work in that place, and she smiled, and now it was the 3rd day of winter. And as she was going back to the house, there was something that brought a smile to her heart. It was a picture that was drawn by her husband on the back of a slate. He wasn't in the picture, but he'd scratched at it with an old rusty nail, and it was her and their 7 children. And even though he wasn't in the picture, it wasn't just the fact that he'd marked his name with a cross at the bottom. It was the fact that she could remember the day that it had happened. It was there, on the mantelpiece. But as she was walking back towards her house, now it was backbreaking work in the nail factory. She would have to carry 60 rods that were sharpened with the machines. Now, she'd heard the other older women talking. In the nail factory, they used hand-operated machines. A handle would be turned to shape the nail and sharpen the nails. But now, in 1810, water-driven and steam-driven machines were taking over. It was loud and noisy and heavy work. For these rods that she would carry, she wouldn't just carry 1 rod between her fingers. It would be about 60 rods, and that weighed about 60 pounds. And they were not that much shorter than her, 4'6" long, 60 rods over her shoulder. When her husband had been alive, she wasn't weak, but she wasn't like she was now, strong in her arms and determined. But as she was making her way back from her work, she had to go past the old farm, the farm where she had worked when she was a child, and the coal ponies were coming up to the side. They were nearly as hungry as all of her children. The 2 oldest boys were really hungry. They would eat everything that wasn't nailed down. In fact, if they had the chance, they would eat the nails as well. But the coal ponies were brushing themselves up against the old wooden fence and nuzzling towards her. Perhaps it was something that they could smell on her that made them recognise her. She stopped her walk, and she pulled some grass from the other side of the field that they couldn't reach even when they strained and stretched their necks. And she took up a bundle of the grass and held it up towards them. But it was winter now. There was snow in the air, but not on the ground. And as she reached towards these 2 coal ponies, she started to speak. I bet you're as tired as I am. Hard work, isn't it? Pulling the coal. You would have known my man. He was a good man. Clever too. Never got any schooling, but he could draw anything. Anything at all. What he couldn't draw. And here she stretched her arm out just a little bit further, and it was a hand that brushed against the thorns of roses. The roses had gone, the flowers were gone, the smell was gone, but the thorns still remained. And it was as she reached with her arm and her hand that one of the thorns scratched at her. Oh! She was used to the nails as she picked them up and carried them, cutting her hands. Oh, her hands were rough and hard. And she sucked at her hand where the blood was dripping down onto the cold ground. And it was as she looked at the thorn, she had an idea. The next day, she went into the factory. She walked, as bold as you like, up to the overseer, the man who would make sure all of the nails were the right size and right shape, and she said, "I have an idea." He looked at her. "So you have an idea, do you? Well, very good. Keep it to yourself and get on with your work." "No, I've really got an idea. An idea that will make the nails quicker and cheaper and faster." The overseer was just about to send her packing again. But he looked. "So what is it then?" She explained to him that as she'd been scratched, she could see the thorns were sharp and straight, and if the nails were to be made in the same way, instead of them being rounded and sharpened and cut, if they were to be taken and at one and the same time they were cut and split and made with a head that would cut into the rods that she'd been carrying, and she knew them very well, then they could make nails quicker, faster and cheaper. The idea was taken to the managers. The managers took it to the owners, and a deal was struck between the owners and her that she would get 1 farthing for every 4 nails that were made with her new process. Instead of the nails being fed into the machines that were driven by steam, they wouldn't just sharpen them and cut them. In one go, they would cut, sharpen, and give them a head. It might not sound very much, a farthing for every 4 nails that were made, but everything was changing. This was a new century. Everyone was wanting factories and workers, and everyone needed to live somewhere. Years later, she went down by the side of the road where she'd used to walk, by the place where she used to work, and she smiled now, for she had beautiful clothes upon her back, for there were many hundreds of thousands of nails made, and with her getting a quarter of a farthing for every one that was made, she now had money in her pocket. She had riches, good clothes, good food, schooling for her children. And her children had taken something from their father. They could draw, they could make things, but they all would look, and as they sat by the side of a fire in their good house, they would look at the picture that was scratched on a slate by their father with an old rusty nail. She would smile. "You did us all right. You kept me going. You've always been good to me." She never did get married again. She would keep that picture, even in the fine house, and remember the time before this time that she'd got a scratch upon the back of a hand that had given her an idea, that had put gold in her pockets and food and schooling for her children.